This is Not Now, Maybe Later, a teen mental health podcast and a project of Sweetser. I'm glad you're listening, so let's get started. Hello, podcast people. Welcome to episode 4. This is the parent episode. This one's going to probably feel a little different. I had the chance to interview someone who's a mom and has a couple of teens with some mental health issues going on. And it's a longer episode, first of all, so get comfortable. And also, you're hearing a conversation sort of behind the scenes. This is what me as a therapist talking to a parent would be about. I hope that that's interesting to hear. I think it might get some people thinking about their own families, the parents they have, the parents that you wish you had, and I thought it would be just a nice perspective to get. It's a real story. This is a real person with a real life. I really enjoyed getting to hear what she had to say. I hope you do too. Well, I am pretty happy to be here with this guest. I have mom here with 3 kids, 2 in high school and 1 in elementary school. And this particular interview, we get to look at the experience of someone raising kids, dealing with mental health issues as their kids grow up. So thanks for coming in, Mom.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
We kind of thought ahead about some stuff we thought would be good to go over, knowing that these hopefully teenagers are listening to this conversation. So just sort of off the bat, what would you say comes into mind first when you think about either teenagers in general and their mental health, or if you want to think more specifically about your own family? Like what's the most important thing?
I guess recognizing that mental illness comes in all different shapes and sizes, not just adults with trauma, but also with children that may have early signs of mental illness or trauma to all the way to elderly and older people.
Absolutely. One of the episodes that will be coming up, we kind of talk about when mental health shows up and how. So I had a middle school clinician on and she was talking about what it looked like from like 11 to 13. And as you know, I'm in a high school, so I can see what happens in those middle teen years. In your own experience, when did you start to become aware that mental health is a part of life for children?
I recognized that it was an issue, or not necessarily a problem, but it was a part of that when I was a child. So approaching my teen years at like 11 or 12, that something was just not quite right inside of me.
Okay, so your own experience gave you maybe some advantage, I guess, if that's the right word for it, as far as being a parent and recognizing things happen. You weren't naive.
No.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say about your own experience that has shaped your view of mental health? So anything from your own teen years that feels like it has brought something to you as far as being a parent goes?
I guess just realizing that I was a teenager too. I made mistakes, I needed guidance, and I had feelings that needed to be validated. And I had to recognize that my children needed to be validated with their feelings and stuff that was going on inside of them.
Absolutely. I showed you that book I read before I came in to meet with you. And the point about validation is huge, just especially with teenagers, right? Because I don't know how much time they give you to listen or to talk or how much information they share with you. But anything you can catch that you're able to say like, that's okay, I understand, or tell me more it's golden nuggets.
Golden nuggets for sure.
This is the disclaimer. This podcast is for your listening enjoyment, but it is not therapy. If you're struggling and need help right now, tell someone in your real life. If you're in crisis and you live in Maine, call or text 888-568-1112 or text the word HOME, HOME, to 741-741. Don't wait. Ask for help. All right. Tell me a bit more about your experience of your children's mental health growing up. So now that you've seen them at the ages they are, again, you've got 2 in high school and 1 in elementary school. If you think back on those older children, how did it look when they were little that turned up again as they grew older?
I realized with my middle child that it started much sooner than I could recognize. He was a very colicky child, had a lot of anxiety and fears that my oldest didn't have. And so that developed into little fears, developed into bigger fears, and soon realized like he had so much bottled inside of him that he never expressed. And it wasn't until he was in middle school that we realized there was a big, huge issue, and he was a scared little boy. And then with my oldest, a lot of that, the pressure of just being a teenager and trying to fit in. And for us, it was a lot of moving around, so developing new friendships and that being really scary. And sometimes, it was like one parent being more of a parent than the other just because of situations, not because of bad. But it created a lot of stressors and child trauma, really. And we don't necessarily look at those things as trauma, because when I hear the word trauma, I think of something big. And really, it can be so simple as maybe a plate dropping on the floor, but it was a favorite plate, and that's trauma.
I appreciate your point. I think it's good for anyone listening to acknowledge moving does shape childhood. And I don't know which is more advantageous, to stay in one town and grow up with everybody knowing you, or to move around a lot. But there's certainly, it matters what point in life it happens. And I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, since that's your family's experience.
The only thing about it that I would say is attachment happens really, really young. And we don't think about that. Like, we just don't. And so I would say my oldest, being a girl, we develop attachments so much quicker than boys were. And so realizing that now and looking back, I'm like, oh, I kind of missed the mark, but now I see it. And so my youngest, being a girl, I'm looking for those cues of like, oh, she was really attached, and I need to acknowledge that feeling, that heartache for her.
No, it's true. And it's social attachment, really. Like, obviously the family attachments are supposed to happen early and pretty hard, like, parents and their children. But the social development of a kid, it does start earlier than I think most people can see. The middle school clinician, again, was talking about how in her experience, a kid shows up in 6th grade still pretty much oriented towards teachers and family. And then by the end of that year, if not right at the beginning of 7th, they are all about friends and privacy and keeping secrets. And I mean, that almost, my kids aren't that age yet, yours have been. That almost sounds like it would give someone a parent whiplash, right?
Yes, very much so.
Do you want to tell me about what that was like for you with maybe your oldest, if it was the first sort of time you watched that growing up happen so quickly?
I would definitely, yes. She was in 6th grade, and all of a sudden it was like she did not want me anymore. She didn't want me to come into the bedroom at nighttime to say goodnight. She didn't want me to read her a story. She pushed away so much for like 3 years. And then when she was a senior, it was like all of a sudden she wanted me again. So it seems more like a phase versus, and it's a long phase. Like, that seems like a forever thing. It's daunting. It was so daunting for me to think she'll never love me. She'll never want me again. This little girl that you bring into this world, like, doesn't want you, doesn't need you, wants her friend's mom versus her real mom. All the things you think about. But I do have to say, it starts to really unfold and come back. They realize how much they really need their parent. For a girl, especially their mom, they need that level of compassion and empathy.
I wonder too, with mental health issues sort of piping up so much more unclearly, but still something is happening, 12, 13, 14 in many cases, does that throw off the wanting to give your child the space and the privacy? So if you think about your own kids, and when your sort of flag went up, like, oh, they're not okay, but they're doing that normal teen thing of like, don't bother me, don't take my phone. Like, how did you handle that they're becoming normal teenagers, but also you're aware that they have some stuff you really want to know about or keep an eye on?
So I guess with my oldest, the biggest thing was I had to remember it's safety first. If it's not a big, huge safety concern, I had to let it go. I had to back off, because the more I pressed in, if it wasn't a big, huge safety issue, the more she pressed away. And I knew that if I backed off she'll eventually just spill because it just naturally comes out of, for my daughter, it just naturally comes out every single time. And I had to realize that. And the moment I realized that, it worked. It just worked. I don't know why. I didn't know if it's going to work for my son, but it worked for her. And so as long as it isn't a big, huge safety issue, let it go.
I don't know if we can do this, but let's think about a kid living in a home where they don't have a good relationship with their parent, where it wouldn't be the sort of norm for that child to maybe feel totally safe and comfortable with that person who's supposed to be providing their care. I don't know. Could you just put that hat on for a second and think about families where that relationship isn't strong to begin with and there you've got a kid who's going through this?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good topic. When you don't have parents in the home that you feel comfortable enough or you can just spill when you're ready, it's super important to try to navigate through the school system. People like you or maybe a teacher, just finding that person that you can feel safe and comfortable with. And generally speaking, it's not until what I'm realizing until teenage years that you do that you can make those connections and understand this is a safe place. Even if it's a teacher or, even if it's a friend's parent. And we don't recognize that until we're older, though. I feel like the safety, as a child, our frontal lobe's not developed enough to know, oh, this is a safe person. So it's so hard, for a young child not to feel safe in their home and not to have anybody. But hopefully they can find it in a school system, church, or, another house. But hopefully, too, teachers and that are able to see that person doesn't have, that you guys are kind of looking for that and kind of see signs and that they might not have anybody.
And it's... When you talk about the younger kids versus the older kids, I think the schools are safety nets for kids. I think a lot of kids who don't have healthy, happy homes are noticed, I really hope, by the adults in the building. There's in any school, there's a number of really fantastic teachers or counselors or principals who just know kids well enough to know when something doesn't seem right. When a teen is in a teen place in life, they're going to be able to shape the story in a different way than a kid in elementary school. They're going to want to possibly protect themselves from getting in trouble. They're going to want to protect maybe their family from getting in trouble if that's the case. So I just want to bring it back to teens for a second. If they're in a sticky situation with their mental health or with their friendships, what's your experience been or what's your lesson been from sort of having to navigate where you've got a teen and you've got a school and you've got other people's families? What's that like?
I can say, so for my oldest, she happens to bring every needy child there is known to man to our home. And I love that about her, and I love that she ultimately, even though privately she might not tell us I feel safe or I love my family, but by experience and by the example she sets is that she brings home kiddos her age to be nurtured on. I mean, just the other day she was having a conversation with somebody over the phone and was pausing and hitting the mute button and was like, "Mom, what do I do? What do I say?" So I recognize that in her, but my son, he will avoid at all cost. He will probably lie just because he doesn't want to bring up the situation. And he probably struggles a little bit more with mental illness in a different way. And so it's important to acknowledge the way she's going to present that is really different than how my son might bring that up.
She's a little bit more transparent about what's going on around her, at least.
Yes.
And you're learning about your older kids, probably. We won't hold your youngest to this conversation since we're looking at teenagers. What do you attribute to their mental health issues that helps shape what decisions you make as far as privileges, to be left home alone or to have friends over or their phones? What have you learned because of their mental health challenges you have to do to keep safety, but also sort of just know what's going on?
I would say firsthand, learn their friends is so important, and knowing where they feel comfortable enough to stretch the boundaries, because when they feel like they can stretch the boundaries, that's when it gets really sticky. That's where they're going to make the mistakes. Mm-hmm. Knowing when they're comfortable, like really comfortable with a friend, that's red flags to me, like all over. I'm looking to when they want to go to a birthday party, but they're 16, and then they call you and they're like, can you come get me? Something is not right there. There's a red flag. Mm-hmm. And I started to like really see that between the ages of like 14 and 16, both in my son and my daughter. Mm-hmm. And so when they're making mistakes and like that with privileges and stuff like phone.
And I think from the teen side of that, realizing you're probably going to get further with being trusted if you're above board, right? If you're sharing as much information about who you're talking to, who you spend time with, problems come up that maybe you're not exactly in the middle of, but are near you, being obvious with your parents about that so that they're not doing what they need to do to find out, because most parents are pretty capable of finding information one way or another. We still have that.
Yeah, Garen, yes, definitely. Like, I still remember, like, one of my kiddos being like, how did you know that? And my answer was, I'm your mom. And still to this day, they're like, how did she find out?
I do have to say, because I do know you, I think your skills are a little bit above average maybe because of your own life experience. Like, I think you have a clue, and from both sides of the fence, right? You have a clue on how to get away with stuff from your own experience, but you also have a clue about how to know what to look for as an adult. So I want to say that as a disclaimer to the audience, that if I had another parent sitting here who hadn't had the same life experience, they might be learning this each time it happens and trying to figure out what the real picture is.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. Thank you.
You're welcome. You don't have to. There's going to be, my hope is this podcast helps teens understand the mental health care system. So you're sort of the first guest who's had a first person, as a parent at least, experience trying to find mental health care for your children. And I'm just wondering if you can share your own experiences with that you feel like sharing, and also maybe some tips to the families.
Yes. So personally speaking, I needed mental health people at a very young age, and it was actually put on me. I didn't get to choose, but I have to say, like, personally speaking, I feel like each one kind of brought something good to the table, and it was always different. As I got older, I realized how much I really did not want to have that, and I don't know if that's because I'm old.
Did that change at all? So you're saying, younger you got a lot of therapists, but as you got older, did your feelings change?
Yes. Feelings definitely changed. I felt very pinpointed, yep, that girl, she goes to therapy, she has to have medication, she's clearly has mental issues. Then as my children, had mental illness, it was less, it's now it's the normal thing. Everybody benefits from having therapy. Personally speaking, for myself, when I had a provider and that provider left, it was almost well, what do I do with my feelings? I have to figure them out for myself. And it was, I can't do that. I need to talk to somebody. I need to have a person. And then even if it was just a psychiatrist, going to get medication, in today's world, it doesn't feel like it matters. It's helpful. And this world, we kind of know that it is helpful. And I mean, we can use meditation and yoga and exercise and stuff too. But I feel like the reality is that therapy helps. Medication can help. And it's not for everybody. But I feel like it's for a lot of people nowadays. I don't feel like it's a shameful thing. It's a helpful thing.
How easy was it when your kids needed to start getting care? How easy was it?
For all of my children, actually, it was super easy.
Okay.
It was almost like school-based therapy. They found my children. Or with my youngest, who's only 9, the school nurse recognized that she was going through a lot and was I really think she'll benefit from talking to the school-based clinician. And with my first, I would have been hesitant and been no, she's way too young. But now realizing that we develop fears and all that at a really young age, and it is incredibly helpful to talk to somebody that can guide you and has expertise in how to get out those feelings that are really scary.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that. I think it might help someone who's not yet dealing with therapy for the first time at 16. And
the transition, I would say, though, from like switching from elementary school to middle school, from middle school to high school, was really difficult to try to develop that new therapist or whatever. Very, very hard. The trust was not, especially for my son, was not there. He had a really, really great therapist, and she left the school, and so it was super hard for him. And then he finally tried another therapist after me pushing and pushing and pushing, and it didn't work. And now we are still kind of searching. And we're not just searching in the school, but we're searching, Psychology Today or Sweetser or just a lot of outside providers, even if it's not just a therapist, even if it's a psychiatrist, and reaching, he does have a psychiatrist now, but like acknowledging to her, I don't have a therapist. Can you help me find one? Really, really digging deep, and kind of sometimes it's exhausting. You're like just looking and looking. Now it's so much easier to minimize when you see crisis. Like speaking in my house, like what might have been really, really scary crisis 4 years ago does not seem like a crisis now. It seems like a normal behavior of I'm hurting and I don't know what to do with my feelings, so I'm going to say these things or do these things. And maybe it's because I was young then, but it was really scary what I was going through with like my son, for instance. And then now if my daughter were to do that, or she has done a lot of things, I'm just like, okay, I hear you. I hear there's something big going on, and we can acknowledge it at home versus let's go get crisis involved.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I was getting at earlier, as far as how has learning about your teen's mental health changed how you parent or how you view things. And that's exactly it, is what might have been a full-scale response to a comment that's made or a text that's sent or a teacher hearing something and you're like, we need to go to the hospital now. You're like, I know my kids pretty well. I know the range. I also can read them enough to know whether or not this is something we need to handle outside of our own support system.
Also think like when you can't read them, that's when you reach out. I oftentimes cannot read my son, very often. And so I have to reach out to a lot of friends that have older teenager boys in particular, and be like, did he go through this? Like, how did you get through it? How did you navigate his feelings? And sometimes I hear some really great things, and sometimes I'm just like, I still need more help. Who do I go to? I don't know. It seems a little bit harder with boys than it does with girls.
And I think what you're getting at, I don't know how often the gender lines are clear, but I think there are teens who shut down, and there are people/teens who act out. So if you have a child who, when they're upset, is blowing up and cursing you out or crying, like it's kind of easy to be like, are you okay? But if your kid is just locking themselves in their room more or not saying much, but maybe that's not that abnormal, for a teenager when they're home with their family, like there's going to be such a subtlety in maybe catching that they're not okay because they suck everything inside of themselves instead of showing it. So I'm thinking maybe that was what you were getting at too with your differences in your children.
Yeah, one is when something's going on, you know it, and it's over talking. It's trying to literally spell out exactly how she's feeling. And if I were to say, well, maybe you should do this, her response might be, no, this is what I'm doing, but she just wants me to listen. She doesn't want me to respond or give advice. And she will eventually spill everything. And my son won't. And if there's something going on, behavioral wise, it's generally he gets caught. Like nothing is going to come out of it unless he gets caught.
A behavior gets caught. He's not communicating anything, but he's doing something.
Yeah, and I would have never known.
Hey listener, I thought I'd jump in for a minute and do a bit of a segue. This conversation with Mom has been going great. I really think she said some interesting things for you to hear from a parent's perspective. And for the next part of the conversation, I had done some research before we met about parent support when you're raising a teenager. And one of the things that came up a couple of times was how communication happens between a teen and their mom, their dad, and the idea of communicating what's expected and what might happen when the teen makes mistakes. So I think this is an interesting part of the interview. I hope you like it. Please keep listening. Let's talk a little bit about communicating with your kids and about your kids. You brought that up in a couple ways, but I wanted to ask you to share a little bit about how you and your partner have learned to communicate your expectations about safety or about very common things for teenagers like drinking or vaping. What's been the most successful, and what, if you want to share any mistakes, you don't have to, but what would you say are the best and worst of it so far?
I absolutely had to learn from you that we set the boundary. We say, this is not allowed in our house. This is not allowed, period. And if you do it, this is what's going to happen. Our biggest thing that we failed on multiple times was no follow through.
Mm-hmm.
We felt guilty for the consequences, even though the behavior did not come from us.
Mm-hmm.
So we would just let in because we were like, she's depressed or he's crying. And especially for me, I would give in. I would just be like, here's your phone back. And it never worked. We never, ever saw, especially our oldest daughter, learn until we followed through. And it wasn't until she made a huge mistake that if she was 18 could have really had major consequences. And so we were like, we didn't get a chance to discuss like, oh, if you ever make this big huge thing, this is going to happen. I feel like those big huge things, they just kind of come up on you and you don't get the opportunity to plan. After making the mistake once or the bad behavior once, you can say, if you ever do that again, this is what's going to happen. If you are caught vaping again, these are the consequences, and stick with it.
Mm-hmm.
And be on the same page with your partner. Talk to them privately, not in front of the child. Have a plan and stick to it.
Mm-hmm. You know, if every parent had a crystal ball when their child's 5 or 6 about which things were going to be the challenges, whether it's dating or substances or which kind of friends you have or school stuff, you know, maybe you'd be prepared. But even a person themselves doesn't know what direction things are going to go or what situations are going to pop up, because they're pretty much just surprised to most people when they happen. Even the teen themselves, like they thought they were hanging out with someone who was a friend, but the friend all of a sudden takes a turn they didn't expect, and now they're in the situation with them. So it's not really fair, but I think it is fair in that everybody gets surprised by this stuff the first time it happens, including the person who did it. I really do believe that, especially with teenagers whose judgment grows with them and often through experience, right? By, oh, that was a horrible decision, I should never do that again, the third time it happens. So I think you're illustrating so well how development is.
And too, like on that topic, like I think that they start to hate the consequence. They're like, oh my goodness, like I don't want everything taken away from me again.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are afraid to do the bad behavior again because they don't want the consequences, especially if you've just given them another thing that they so desperately wanted, such as a social media, or you can go, your curfew is an hour later. Like when they're handed those amazing rewards for being really good, they don't want to lose them if they've already lost them 3 times. They're like finally learning their lesson. It's a little bit harder with the younger kids. It takes a while, but when you're 16, 17 years old, like, no, I do not want my cell phone taken away for 2 months. And that's another thing. It's super important to be realistic about consequences. We had to learn that, like, because we wanted to just like rip everything away, you get nothing.
Forever.
Like you're never getting it back, or you're never going to be left alone again. Just be realistic.
Yeah, because everybody has to live with that.
Yes, and it affects everybody. So more than likely, the longest, or you take away their cell phone for 2 months, that means everybody is going to be miserable for 2 months because they're going to respond to that consequence, most likely in a negative way.
And need to use your phone. And
yep, if you can't go drive somewhere, you get grounded from driving. I instantly have to be the one to drive you everywhere, and that does not make me happy, but I have to stick with it. I have to stick with the consequence, and if I don't, then they win. And I guess it's not about a win or a lose, but it really, like, it boils down to they're not going to learn the full lesson if you don't follow through.
All right. So I mentioned some topics that might be relevant for any teenager but yours. And I didn't know if there's anything else related to mental health you wanted to say about some of the big themes in the teenage years, like dating or substance use, or just school and kind of figuring out futures. What, if anything, did you think your children either having their mental health in bad shape or being well managed? How has that played out with these big things that they're supposed to be figuring out?
So I would say like the really big things, when I think about probably the biggest situation that's ever happened with my oldest, it wasn't until every adult around her knew and they reminded her over and over, we are going to support you. We're going to tell you when you're right. We're going to tell you when you're wrong. We're going to tell you when we're proud of you, and we're going to tell you when we're disappointed. We're going to stand with you. And so it was important for her to realize that we all see you struggling and we're going to come around you. We love you no matter what. That's not going to change. And I think we have to be intentional about expressing that to our children and the people that we have coming around our children, whether it be church people or school teachers or friends' parents. Come around. It takes a village to raise a child. It really does, whether they're 9 or they're 16, 15, 17, 35. Like, it's still, we all need a village.
I was thinking too, on the other side of it, something I try to say a lot. It doesn't really matter which person I'm talking to in this room, but something I try to say a lot is, even when you're telling yourself certain negative things, like I really failed or nobody likes me, like the really negative messages, if you're hearing it from someone else, don't doubt that they mean it. Now, obviously, as a child, when their mother says, you're wonderful and I love you, I guess it's kind of hard to take that seriously because hopefully you've been hearing it your whole life and it's true. But I do appreciate how you said, like, it does take a village, because when that teen is in a rough spot and the relationship with their parent is on a little bit of thin ice because the parent's got to hold consequences or the child has to fess up to whatever it is, there are still other people who can positive message to them, like their therapist. Obviously, we're here to just say, like, you did screw up and this is going to be rough. Here's some reasons why you're going to be okay. But I wanted to take this opportunity to say that message here, that even when you don't feel like you're good, if other people are saying it, just take that. Just take it. You don't have to believe it, but take it. They're not lying to you. Like, you are good.
Yes. Yeah, that's really good. I think it's so easy as a parent to be really hard on yourself and ashamed a lot of times when your child makes a big, huge mistake. And you don't want to tell anybody. You want to keep it quiet. And then sometimes people find out and it's like, oh my goodness, what did I do? How do I fix this? No one's going to ever look at me the same way. And it's so hard.
Yeah.
It is so hard. I think that as teenagers, they are looking for approval of others. And I still think as a mom, we are looking for approval of others, right? You think that changes, but it really doesn't. It just looks a little bit different.
And I think for families where there are teens with mental health issues, it's a different walk.
Yes,
it
very different walk.
It's just, you're going to have more issues. You're going to have more learning opportunities from things not going right, because that's what mental health that's untreated or unmanaged does. And again, teenagers are supposed to be experimenting and learning and making mistakes and growing that way too. So it's going to happen twice as much for the people that I work with and for your children along the way.
I would say that a child or a teenager with mental illness, when they make the mistakes, they tend to make much bigger ones than a child that doesn't have mental illness. Coming from, a mom's perspective, it seems like mental illness, you lie big, you steal big, you vape big, you do the big behaviors, and you don't just do them once, even if you're caught the first time. You keep doing them. And so it's important to recognize that mental illness makes it much harder for them to make good choices much quicker and to reach out and to learn from it.
And diagnoses like depression or trauma or ADHD, you also feel big. So, which, drives the behaviors and causes the behaviors cause the feelings. It's that nice triangle from CBT, right? They're all connected, but the feelings are bigger. The control is harder. with those kind of diagnoses. It's coming from something other than just pure willpower or personality, how things go.
Right.
And I'll tell you that on my end, that's the therapy at this age, is helping a teen recognize what's their mental health, what's their personality, how do you blend these two things together, how do you get support, like kind of learning to understand and live with something that is bad right now, could get better, might come back along the way. And I just wanted to say that right now because I think it's great that we can take this opportunity to do the validating of like, this walk is different. If you're dealing with a mental health issue, many more than I just named, there are going to be more mistakes. There are going to be more situations, and there's going to be probably a lot more strong feelings than your friend who has no things and just happens to have the perfect family and really solid mental health.
Yeah, definitely.
Good. We said it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you very much, Mom, for coming in with your experience, with your kids' experience, your knowledge and parent learning. I think it's kind of a really nice little nugget to have listeners get to think about their own families and their own parents and those relationships.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of Not Now, Maybe Later. This is a project of Sweetser. I am your producer and host, Emily Ostro. Thank you to the artist SuperRar for use of the song Dopamine Hits, as sampled in this episode. Thank you to Laura Sunderland Photography for the photo shoot. Thank you to Pixabay for free access to sound effects for this episode. And most especially, thank you to my sound engineer. You know who you are, and I love you so much. Please listen, follow Not Now, Maybe Later on your favorite podcast platforms. If you'd like to email suggestions, you can write to notnowmaybe.later podcast@gmail.com. Thanks, and talk to you soon.